All right, let's move on to the final topic then, and this one is a big one, Stefan. Borussia Dortmund. We weren't going to talk a ton about the games, the midweek games in the transfer show, with the one exception, and that's the Holstein Kiel 4-2 win over Borussia Dortmund on Tuesday. I don't even know where to start here. This was an absolute disaster class by Borussia Dortmund in the first half. They were better in the second half, but not good enough to come back. I don't think at any point they deserved to get a point or win this game. I think the performance in the first 45 minutes was some of the worst that we've seen from them this entire season, and that says a lot. And that of course means we have a whole bunch of questions now surrounding head coach Nuri Sahin. There's reports that Erik Ten Hag was at the stadium watching the games. It's been described as a shadow coach. I think, when you get reports like that leaking out, then you know what the situation is. They also been linked to a potential move to Sandro Wagner, right? Sandro Wagner, the assistant coach of Julian Nagelsmann. Personally, I would love that. I think Sandro Wagner is an excellent coach. He's a big reason why Germany have done so well. He does a lot of work with Julian Nagelsmann. I'm not sure Borussia Dortmund can get him. To be quite honest, I think they probably have a better chance getting Erik Ten Hag, but we'll see. But the fact that we now have these head coach names circulating in Dortmund means that it is going somewhere. But at the same time, this is Dortmund. They've also said that they, as usual, they have come up with the excuses and saying that we keep going and we're planning with Nuri Sahin, etc., etc. But as you rightfully pointed out in your newsletter, you just look at their schedule and what's coming up, and they really only maybe a defeat or two away from having to make this decision regardless.
Yeah, absolutely. The game itself and the performance we'll probably talk about in the main show in terms of the actual football. But yeah, it's interesting that Ten Hag was at the game. It was almost kind of reminiscent of Edin Terzic sitting in the stands when Marco Rose was kind of struggling as Dortmund head coach. It's funny how kind of history repeats itself with these things. I think the weird thing is, despite his struggles at Man United, I think there's probably a lot to take from his time at Man United and both Ajax and say, a move to Dortmund might be the best thing for Ten Hag, and it might actually be the best thing for Dortmund as well. Now, I know head coaches coming from Holland haven't always been worked well for Dortmund in recent years. Previous head coaches have not really quite worked out. Peter Bosz probably being the most obvious example of that. But I think what Ten Hag probably will take away from his time at Man United is that he wasn't quite ready to take on a club of that size. And by that, I mean, the media scrutiny, the fan scrutiny, the tussles he must have constantly had with huge names and huge personalities in that changing room. Not to mention the never-ending demands to win every single game, despite the fact that, Man United just are not as well resourced in terms of finances or player quality as their rivals in the Premier League. So as better head coaches have proved before him, and some may prove afterwards, it was an impossible task for the most part. I'm intrigued to see what he can do at Dortmund just as well, because, if you then kind of put that to one side and look at his success at Ajax, it's exactly the kind of guy that Dortmund probably should have been going for at the time. Obviously he'd done tremendously well for Ajax in the league, but what he's probably most famous for is his form in the Champions League, where he got them obviously to the semi-finals of the competition, and then got to the group stages as well after that. Sorry, the round of 16, beating some big teams. So, tactically, he has shown that he's capable of doing pretty well. And actually, the things that really stand out to me about his time at Manchester United is that he did actually, these kind of one-off games against better teams, like Manchester City comes to mind. I think they beat Liverpool as well a few times. He did know how to set his team up to frustrate. He knew how to set up his teams to play tactically. And that's maybe something that Dortmund need. Now, it might kind of ring some alarm bells from Dortmund fans and say, that's kind of what we had needing Terzic, and I completely agree, to be perfectly honest with you. But I think what Ten Hag would bring to Dortmund is that capacity to win games week to week, which he needed to do at Ajax. But he also has a capacity to set teams up defensively or counter-attacking ways to beat better sides, which I think would be quite fascinating because suddenly Dortmund would have a head coach who would perhaps know how to trouble the likes of Bayern Munich and Leverkusen, Leipzig, whoever else is in the race, Frankfurt, who they're obviously playing on Friday. So I don't know. I don't know why I'm so. I'm not sure if optimistic is the word, but I'm intrigued by the idea of Ten Hag at Dortmund. I guess I just think that's the perfect kind of spot for him to then try and rebuild his career, because obviously he did what he did at Ajax, and I think the natural progression from there probably would have been the Bundesliga. I was kind of chatting to someone at work about this this week, and I was kind of saying, off the back of how I think he maybe struggled with the size of Manchester United. That's also something that might play to his hands, and this is maybe going to come across as maybe a bit of a backhanded insult to Dortmund, but they just don't strike me as a club who treat themselves like a big club. They talk about how they've got the 16th highest revenue in the world or something like that, and Sebastian Kiel was on the doing interviews last week saying he wants to make them one of the kind of top 15 clubs in the world, but there's definitely not that culture or that kind of breakneck speed that you get at other clubs like Bayern and Man United and Real Madrid and things like that. I just don't get that vibe when I go to Dortmund and I speak to people there, and even just the way that they react to things and do things. And that's probably why they're in the mess that they're in now. But it might be something that kind of suits Ten Hag, because he can kind of go into that environment and kind of actually get to work rather than just reacting to things constantly like he did at Manchester United. So I don't know. This might come back to bite me if he does get a job, and in 6 months' time he's an abject failure. But I'd be quite intrigued by Ten Hag, more so than Sandro Wagner, I must admit. I don't think Wagner's a bad head coach, and I'm sure you could probably talk more about what he has done in his career to date. But I was on, I can't remember if it was one of our subscribers actually, I think maybe in the chat, said Dortmund have to get away from this idea of constantly trying to reinvent the next Pep Guardiola or the next Xabi Alonso. They keep going for these young head coaches and hoping that one of them will turn into, the reincarnation of Hitzfeld or something like that. It's not really going to work. They have to start looking. They have to change the system. They have to start hiring head coaches with a track record, who know what they're doing, and can pull them back up to being the second or third best team in Germany. Maybe Sandro Wagner can do that. Maybe it's not fair to tar him with that brush and say he's like Terzic or he's like Nuri Sahin. But that would be my only concern about Sandro Wagner in this regard.
No, and I think that's very fair. I think Sandro Wagner is a huge talent. He's only 37. He has enormous personality. He has done tremendous work at Unterhaching, and now does tremendous work with Julian Nagelsmann at the German national team, where he's, we saw with Dino Topmöller, who worked for many years with Nagelsmann, and then went to Frankfurt to do his own thing, right? And the success that he's had with Frankfurt, especially this season, I think Sandro Wagner can have a similar trajectory, but I would urge him to maybe go. Let's say Sebastian Hoeneß moves on to Leverkusen at some point, or to Bayern Munich. That Stuttgart job would be perfect for him, right? Because that's an environment where he can step in and be sort of like Sebastian Hoeneß. They're both from Munich as well. I feel like people from Munich would have had a tough time in taking charge of a club like Dortmund, because the mentality is just so very different, right? And you touched on the mentality here. It's actually, I think, one of the big things that hold Dortmund back. As you were talking here about they always like to talk themselves down, right? You would never see that from anyone from Munich. They would talk themselves up. There is this self-proclaimed confidence, and this is especially if you have worked for a club like Bayern Munich, where Sandro Wagner he's a Bayern Munich product, right? He played for Bayern Munich later on in his career. You are going to get that confidence automatically, and I think that would clash enormously with the culture that Dortmund have at the moment. I think that the difference between Man United and Dortmund is, and they're both doing it to such an extreme that it hurts them, is Man United think that they're a big club, but they're not anymore. And Dortmund are a big club, but they're talking themselves down to such an extent that they are actually in trouble because of it. Because they're almost thinking too small in many ways. And I think that is probably due to the fact that the financial bankruptcy in the early 2000s to this day is holding them back, right? Makes them very conservative when it comes to money and thinking, because Dortmund had that thinking of, we want to become that mega club in German football, and it almost cost them their future. And I think to this day, that is something that holds them back. And Watzke is one of those personalities that saved the club back then. So as long as he's around, you will have that conservative financial approach and this conservative thinking approach that, we are still like on the cusp of maybe going bankrupt one day, which is probably not true. But, with that in mind, I think Sandro Wagner would arrive there and they would tell him to keep it small. And that's just not his personality. I don't think it would work. And so, I think he would be probably better suited for a club like Stuttgart. Stuttgart are thinking big, right? They're moving things forward. They are a club that has made enormous strides, even though their season this year isn't quite as good as last year. I think, that would be a more progressive club for a coach like Sandro Wagner. I personally think Erik Ten Hag would be an amazing hire for Dortmund, Stefan. For all the things that you've outlined, he brings the personality, he's a bit quieter, he's Dutch. I think tactically, he is an excellent coach. I'm not, it didn't work out for him at Man United, although you have to probably add it's gotten worse and not better since he's left. So, how much of that is really up to him and how much of that is really the culture that Man United are still trying to regain, right? This was always something where he was set up for failure. I think that he goes to Dortmund and they let him work, and give him the freedom to work. He could do some really great things. I mean, this is a head coach who was also heavily linked with Bayern Munich for some time. And I think, Dortmund had an excellent experience with Thomas Tuchel. They ended that early. They were almost afraid of the success they had with Tuchel, but they ended as early. And I think Erik Ten Hag, from what he has done in the past, he could be a similar big hire than Thomas Tuchel. And you're right, they need to move away from hiring small coaches with no pedigree. The next coach has to be one with a big pedigree, someone that the players in the dressing room listen to. And I think Erik Ten Hag will be that person.